Before CC introduces the panel, I'd like to offer a brief introduction to the Platypus to everyone here. So the Platypus Affiliated Society is an international organization with a number of regional affiliates, which are independent of any oversight. We are the chapter here established at UVA, and the point of Platypus is to foster the conversation on the left. So a conversation where leftists are talking to each other. The Platypus Affiliated Society, in addition to holding panels like this to have this conversation, also organizes formal and informal discussion about the old 1920s to 1930s left, the new 1960s to 1970s left, and the post-political 1980s to 1990s left, for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. Our mission is not to take part in the politics of existing structures and systems, but to discuss and critique them for clarifying the possibilities of liberalism and the left in the present and future. That being said, the chapter here at UVA holds 2 weekly events. We have our reading groups on Fridays from 5 to 7 p.m. in Cog Hall 101, the Philosophy Building. And on Mondays, we have our coffee chats, which are on the first floor of this building in now Gibson Hall from 1 to 3 p.m. We also host panels like this. We host public fora in addition, which fall under public fora. We have movie screenings, and we generally promote informal discussion about the left in Charlottesville. We also have a Discord server, which you can join by scanning the QR code in the pamphlet that was placed next to the door. That being said, I'll hand it over to Cece.
Okay. The last panel that Platypus held actually landed squarely and accidentally on Thomas Jefferson's birthday, April 13th. The occasion for that panel was another talk given here by Vice President Mike Pence, which swept grounds into a month-long controversy and no less than 3 separate letter-writing campaigns, spanning from the Cap Daily to the Jefferson Independent. Platypus, me, played his own role. I was the one who wrote the open letter in the Jeff Independent, and we hosted a panel discussion on a talk that Mike Pence gave. The date of this panel is not as significant as April 13th. I guess it's the day before St. Patrick's Day, which is significant in its own way. But the occasion for this panel carries much more weight than Mike Pence. Mike Pence was not a phenomenon. The paper storm he generated was by reaction. Bernie Sanders, on the other hand, summoned dozens of people to line up in front of Oak Capitol for more than 2 hours before seating began. And they, or we, because I was also there, were there because we wanted to see Bernie in the flesh. So it's fair to say that Bernie Sanders is significant for the millennial and Gen Z left. The millennial left inherited a heavy burden as a successor to the 90s left, and indeed it did its fair share with the anti-Iraq protests and the Occupy movement in 2011. Then after a few years of relative quiet, the left surged again as Bernie Sanders, the self-described Democratic Socialist senator from Vermont, blazed the presidential campaign trail in 2016 and again in 2020, which included the fervor of the Gen Z left as well. I think it's fair to say that he was like the furthest a socialist has ever gotten in American politics since Gene Dez. So the question for tonight is this: why is Bernie Sanders so damn popular? And what is the appeal of the old man from Vermont to the young leftists of today? And if he wins, which is a big if, would he even be the right way forward for the left? I'll take a brief moment to introduce our panelists. To my immediate right is Nick Gentry, who is the chair of the Political Education Committee in the UVA chapter of YDSA, the Young Democratic Socialists of America. He's a 30-year studying history and American studies. Second from me is Professor Emily Filler, who is the chair of the Political Education Committee in the Charlottesville chapter of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. She is also the professor of Judaism, Moral and Political Philosophy at Washington and Lee University. Third from me is Professor David Walsh, who is an interdisciplinary postdoctoral fellow at UVA, who studies far-right politics, political culture, conservatism, labor, political economy, and in particular, he is researching far-right and conservative politics in the U.S. in the 20th and 21st century, and the relationship between those forms of politics in America with broader global movements. He is working on his upcoming books, Taking America Back, the Conservative Movement and the Far Right. And furthest from me is Professor Spencer Leonard. He teaches in the Sociology Department at James Madison University. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in History and South Asian Languages and Civilizations in 2009. He's a former editor of Sublation magazine, and perhaps more relevant for tonight, Professor Leonard is a founding member of Platypus Affiliated Society, which is, as Anthony said, an international leftist organization dedicated to educating the younger generations in the history and politics of the left. Professor Leonard has been a leftist since he was politicized on this campus some 30 years ago. And with that said, Nick, you can begin your opening statement.
Okay. I guess I was sort of invited here to represent the sort of youth, considering that obviously Bernie Sanders has a pretty big appeal among the youth. And so I think that I'm sort of a prototypical example of someone who Bernie appealed to. The first real political action that I participated in was when I was 16, right before the pandemic in early 2020. I signed up to knock doors in my neighborhood for Bernie Sanders, and that was sort of my entry into leftism and socialism in general, which sort of brought me here. I think that the reason why Bernie Sanders is so appealing is, pretty almost self-explanatory. I think that he's obviously a really good orator, and he points out, the contradictions in capitalism and the very obvious flaws in our society that in a way that's easy to understand. A few years ago, when I was, in early 2020, late 2019, I didn't really know anything about socialism. And if anything, I felt like it was maybe a little bit scary. But I did know that I had a friend who wasn't able to get wasn't able to get health care because of his health insurance, and I knew that was wrong. And so, Bernie Sanders sort of provided sort of somewhere for me to, put that frustration in a productive way and sort of envision a better future, I suppose. And I think a lot of people felt the same way, that, they saw a lot of problems around them, and Bernie Sanders gave them somewhere to channel that. I think some people have sort of moved on from Bernie Sanders at this point to a certain extent. And in response to the second part of the question about Bernie Sanders winning, I really can't imagine Bernie Sanders winning anything at this point. He's very old. And I don't know. I don't really see him running in the upcoming election, but maybe. But I think that part of the reason why he got such a warm reception on the campus was because, honestly, because of a little bit of nostalgia. I know for me it was Bernie Sanders sort of reminds me of a time when I had a little bit more hope in politics. I remember being just absolutely convinced, the weekend before Super Tuesday, we're gonna win this whole thing, and everything's gonna be good. Obviously, it didn't turn out that way, but it's a little bit nostalgic for that time. So yeah, I don't know if Bernie Sanders is I don't really think that he's the future of the left or anything, as sort of part of this panel is sort of implying as part of the debate. But I think that he was a valuable introduction to leftist politics for a lot of people, including myself, and probably a lot of people in this room. A lot of people, especially at this like specific age range, people who are like graduating high school, right, or in high school, right around the time that that Bernie was running. So, yeah, I guess that's my opening statement. Thanks.
Sure. Hi, y'all. Thanks, Cece, for doing this. I definitely don't have an opening statement, but I have lots of opening thoughts and like polemical remarks. So maybe I'll just say those and we can like fight them through. Cece says that the goal of panels like this is for a bunch of leftists to go at it. So I'm happy to fight with y'all or y'all. You know, they can like fight each other. To the question of why Sanders is so popular, and I should say, by the way, I refuse to call politicians by their first names. So please, I mean, like everyone else should talk about Bernie if you wish, but like politicians go by their last names and use Sanders. And the question of why he's so popular, I'll begin by actually saying I'm not sure that he is. So numerically speaking, popularity can be measured in certain ways, and Sanders lost a couple of elections. And various other sub-elections pay substantially. So the kind of appeal, numerically speaking, I think is a kind of complicated phenomenon. There's like an actual sociologist on the panel, so maybe we can talk about that. But I do think that he arouses strong feelings in people who were interested in him in his campaign, and that's different from the way people feel about politicians, whether or not anyone should have any strong feelings at all in a positive regard toward politicians, but I think that's a question we can like fight about. But it is absolutely the case that he aroused strong positive feelings in lots of people toward politicians, and as like terrible as it is for me to admit, even I, in my cold dead heart, like felt a slight like warming sometimes when I would hear him speak. So that's what it is. There's numerical popularity, which actually in the end is something that's not quite present. But there's also sort of strong feelings of a kind that create a kind of like communal affect, and Sanders absolutely has that. Now, I thought that the way that Cece posed the question was a little interesting. How is it that an old white senator from Vermont aroused these feelings in people? I actually want to suggest that in as much as aesthetics are really important to politics, so how people look and how they sound and what kind of vibe accompanies them, that actually the like old rumpled whiteness was actually part of Sanders' appeal. Now, I want to be really clear about this because I do not believe that a woman with the same presentation or affect could be successful. So a man, particularly an older man, can have a kind of rumpled affect, right? They can have like kind of a cheap-looking jacket or something, or the like meme of him with those big gloves on. So a woman, I think, in politics could not be successful with that aesthetic. So to whatever degree that aesthetic is attractive or interesting, I think that's a very gendered phenomenon, and I think that's like important to say. That said, I don't think that those features of him were things despite which people found him appealing. I actually think those were like part of the appeal. And I'm not sure all the answers that we can think of to why that's true are good. But I do think they're important to say. The first is that we do associate like certain ways of being aged with being, as it were, sort of beyond friends, right? And whatever you might say about Bernie Sanders, you wouldn't say he's like super hip, but maybe he's like a little vintage, right? It's like he's like neo hip or something. Like I don't know, like sort of old core or something. We can imagine aesthetic that like emerges from that, right? All of a sudden it's like you wear like a crop top and big mittens. So there's something about that about him. I also do think, so I think the old is real. I think that his like personal aesthetic is real. He's clearly sort of, at least by the standards that we measure these things, not that good at being polished. And a lack of polish in a certain way, again, I'm very much among men, can like signal things that seem appealing, or I hate these words, but like authentic, or real. Like there's something sort of less political about him in the if we can imagine political with a kind of sleazy vibe around it. The third thing that I think we do have to consider, and I say this advisedly, but also with like some trepidation, he wasn't and isn't great at talking like a very contemporary like identity politics patois. He's not great at talking about race, and he's not great at talking about gender always. He wasn't always bad, but he wasn't always good at that. And I do think that is like a phenomenon that needs to be part of how it is that we talk about Sanders, or what was interesting about him, or in what ways he seemed to like transcend other kinds of like intra-left debates or arguments, for better or for worse. I think that was real about him and appealing. I'm not actually sure, I wouldn't actually call him like a good orator per se, but whatever he was in his sort of rhetorical style, he was very much that, right? And you could expect that in a certain way. It was very recognizable. It had a very particular sound to it. Like for all that he's like a white guy from Vermont, he has this very kind of particular like working class like Jewish accent. The accent's a New York accent, but in the United States it just signals Jewish so much. And so that was a little bit part of the kind of vintage about him. Actually, in the sense that we could think of him in a certain sense as like the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the old left, right? So if we could mark the decline of the old left, which is to say these kind of leftist movements, anarchist and communist and socialist movements in the United States through the 1940s, you can a little bit imagine him emerging out of that. Right? He's a little bit a person out of time. A person his age was a more ubiquitous phenomenon in the United States in like the 1970s. Right? We can imagine him sort of being there in this moment as a person his age. He's a little bit out of time. There are not so many people like him. And the last thing is I don't think Bernie Sanders is going to win anything, and I don't know who is going to win anything or what winning is going to mean. I think the earth is going to like fall in the sun. But I do think I'll use this to like pivot in a very kind of politician-y way to say that I do think that the left needs to have a kind of long conversation about the role of electoralism in thinking about what it means to be the left, and thinking about voting and electoral campaigns as a meaningful phenomenon or not, and whether or not that's a good way for the left to think about politics generally. And I think Sanders was maybe a good springboard for that kind of conversation, right? That was an actual electoral phenomenon, like where all of a sudden like anarchists were like, I'm an anarchist, but also I'm voting for this guy who's like basically kind of a left-wing Democrat. That's like a fascinating phenomenon. And then he did that, right? And then they faded back into the brush, like Homer Simpson, right? But I do think that maybe he's a good foundation for having that conversation about whether or in what ways electoralism is a strategy that the American left should think about. That is my opening non-statement, and thanks for having me.
Well, there's a lot on the table there, and I'm a late addition to this panel, so I got the email about this about 24 hours ago, so I had no prepared whatsoever. But there's a couple of things that I think are just picking up on what my co-panelists have said so far. There's a couple of thoughts. One is I completely agree that bracket conversation about electoral politics, but clearly Bernie Sanders is not the future of Democratic electoral politics.
At least not a little.
Yeah, exactly. Now, he's not going to run for president in 2024. Joe Biden will probably run for president again. There's not going to be a Democratic challenger. It is what it is. And if there is, it's certainly not going to be Bernie Sanders. Although who the hell knows? I mean, lots of people, we can all have a coronary and die at this very moment. Yeah, well, let's think about my own mortality. So, with regard to Sanders' popularity among young people, which I do think is very, very, very real. And if you go back to the electoral data from, I'm like the political historian, so I'm not saying electoralism is the right solution, but this is what I know. So I will go into this a little bit of detail. That overwhelmingly, in pretty much every state except for South Carolina and there were two others in the South, Sanders wins under 40s pretty much hands down. In most states, it's a complete blowout. So, when we talk about the Sanders phenomenon as being primarily sort of youth-oriented, you can look at electoral returns and see that. I think that, and really the both of you had brought this up in your opening statements, this question of nostalgia, which I think is really, really interesting. I was re-watching the speech that he gave, the Q&A that he gave at UVA when I got invited to this panel. As I was watching, I was thinking, this reminds me of, there's a quip that, where it's from, but it's about Franklin D. Roosevelt. And there's a guy who was, I think, part of UMW, the United Mine Workers, who was telling a reporter in 1936 why he loved FDR so much. And he said something to the effect that FDR is the first politician who knows that my boss is a son of a bitch. And when we think about the Sanders phenomenon, that's it. And we're all, most of us on this panel are faculty members either at this university or other universities in Virginia, and we have our own very strong and pretty angry thoughts about the state of these institutions and how they treat their workers and public education very large in this country. And, you watch Sanders and guy gets it. He's able to articulate that kind of dissatisfaction with the status quo, and that kind of sense, and it's a very generational one too, of you're getting screwed over in a very, very profound way. It's something that you know, and it's not something that gets articulated very much by really anybody in American politics who's running for office. So I think that goes. I think that goes a long way to explaining it. And I also think that that's one of the. Again, Bernie Sanders is not the future of the Democratic Party, but that sentiment, that sense of dissatisfaction, that ain't going anywhere. It's not as if it's not as if, again, I'll use the FDR now. It's not as if happy days are something to be here again. There is we're all familiar with the sort of broader structural crisis in America and American capitalism. I'll add one more point, because I've been thinking a lot about this in the context of my wife is from Chicago. I've been following the mayoral election there quite closely. When you think about the limits of electoralism, and I'm not thinking about this in terms of a political strategy for the left going forward. I'm thinking about what this reflects about left-wing political power, particularly in American cities, right now. And we bring in the New York election as well, the Eric Adams election, Mayor of last year. Now, on the one hand, it looks like the polls have Paul Vallas, who's a very right-wing white Democrat in New York, in Chicago, having a comfortable but not commanding lead over Brandon Johnson, the CTU-backed candidate for mayor. It's something like 44 to 39 in polls. And it's very likely he's going to be the next mayor of Chicago. Now, that all being said, though, you have a phenomenon where you have situations where the left may not be in a position, as it was not the case in New York in 2020, 2019, getting my sequences, when Eric Adams, not in a position to actually win a citywide election outright. That being said, the left is in a position where it can really act as a spoiler or a kingmaker. Lori Lightfoot is gone. She is out of Chicago politics. Well, not out of Chicago politics, but she's out of Chicago electoral politics. She's not going to be reelected as mayor of Chicago. And in no small part, that's because of the political mobilization around CTU. Again, it's not capable of seizing, so I'll wrap it up with this. The left is not capable of seizing state power in the United States right now. We'd like to get to a point where it can. But electorally, certainly, it's not capable of seizing state power. And at moments when it appears like it can, like in Buffalo last year, there's all sorts of red fuckery. Right? That being said, though, it is still a significant and increasingly, and I use this word with some trepidation because it can go any number of different ways, but an increasingly institutionalized part of American politics in the 2020s. That can change very rapidly. We've seen this before in American history. McCarthy's in the 1950s being probably the most prominent example. But certainly compared to this post-left moment or this post-political moment in the 1990s, the left is part of American politics and has, within significant limits, political power in the United States in the 2020s. And I think the Sanders phenomenon is very much part and parcel. Anyway, that's all I did.
So I did write a few things. I can tell you right now I'm going to come off as the ultra-leftist on this. In part because the organization that I helped to found when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago really was sort of summoned into being by the millennial generation, the generation just above yours. And I want to talk about Sanders as a kind of culmination and liquidation of the millennial left, which really contrasts very strongly with my own generation, Generation X, which sort of has no political identity and did nothing other than sort of follow in the wake of the new left in the 1980s. And so I want to both sort of mark the millennial left and describe what I think is the collapse of it. And I think both the question of the sort of post-left 90s is important, and the way that Bernie Sanders is sort of New York Jewish, rumpled whiteness really invoked, I think is what you were saying, the new left, and the kind of the civil rights movement and the question of
the old left.
Yeah, and its relationship to an older left. Okay, with that said, the background of the millennial left was in the anti-war movement. George W. Bush was president, and the sectarian left emerged for its last hurrah. The Revolutionary Communist Party organized the Not in Our Name movement, and the International Socialist Organization took the lead in organizing the Answer Coalition, the two main groups that organized the anti-war movement. As they had done with the immigrant rights movement just a few years before. The organizations that emerged from the old Communist Party and from American Trotskyism in the 1960s and 70s, in other words, still stalk the earth, they were there to organize a massive anti-war movement which intersected a new generation that was happy to participate, even as they refused to do what my generation, Generation X, did, which was to follow in the footsteps of the 60s and 70s new left. They would not join their organizations or wholly reproduce their imagination, at least at first. And indeed, the aging new left encouraged the young, I remember this, not to make the same mistakes that we did. This was the dynamic of, for instance, the Students for Democratic Society, the New Students for Democratic Society in 2006. And that was precisely the milieu out of which Platypus was born 17 years ago. There was an opportunity clearly visible then to break with the history of the compounded failures of the 20th century left and the unchecked and largely unrecognized regression that had accompanied it. Then the first test came in the form of Obama. All the force of the old New Left's legacy, the civil rights movement, was brought to bear to sweep the discontented youth into the 2008 election. At the same time, the economic crisis hit, and the anxieties of the millennials were confirmed. It's a very sort of doom-filled generation, largely because of that. The belated response came with Occupy, a half-hearted protest against the first black president, a gesture that was repeated with the outbreak of Black Lives Matter, Ferguson, 3 years later. The left, meanwhile, was rediscovering the party question, in part occasioned by the emergence of Syriza in the Greek debt crisis and of Podemos in Spain, both of which expressed discontent with the old social democratic and communist parties of Europe. The second volume of the Platypus Review Reader that I'm currently editing documents this process of death. Then came Sanders in the U.S. and Jeremy Corbyn in the U.K. Here finally was a way to overcome the legacy of the old sectarian left and new left. In the U.S., the millennial left had announced its presence, perhaps with greatest clarity, through Jacobin magazine. While very much connected to a kind of Cold War anti-communist leftist sectarianism rooted in the past, that of Michael Harrington's Democratic Socialists of America, it was a new and decidedly useful publication that suddenly all the older leftists wanted to write for. At first attracted to the neo-Kautskian aspiration to overcome sectarianism associated with the Communist Party of Great Britain's Mike McNair, Jacobin's editor, Oscar Santara, was also quite aware of the historical antecedents of the strategy that he came to espouse in 2015-16, that of supporting the Sanders campaign. Indeed, in the winter 2016 issue, Jacobin ran an article about the failed reorientation strategy of the DSA in the 1960s. Indeed, the chief organizer for Martin Luther King Jr., Bayard Rustin, had been a major architect of that reorientation strategy as a member of the DSA that sought to reconstitute American socialism through a takeover of the Democratic Party in the 1960s in an alliance of its then strong labor base with Southern blacks. The millennial left was not going to fall for the old lesser evilism that simply relied on spinning fantasies about the Republicans to get left-curious people to shut up and get in the voting line. No, they were going into the Sanders campaign with eyes wide open. Then Trump won the Republican nomination. This was a godsend for the Democrats, not because he would be, as they supposed, easier to defeat than, say, Jeb Bush. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But he was a godsend because, as a political outsider and a living embodiment of the political crisis of neoliberalism, Trump could easily be painted as a fascist, despite his being plainly no worse, though no better, than recent past presidents Obama, W., Clinton, and Daddy Bush. I think it's really hard to argue that Trump is worse than the presidents of Bush. Already, Hillary supporters had put Sanders on their back foot with their accusations that Sanders was racist and sexist. And anyway, Hillary, after all, was the wife of the first true black president. Plus, she weren't no ways tired and carried hot sauce in her purse. Through the fantastic anti-Trumpism of 2016-2017, the Democrats completed the work that Obama had begun, the total absorption of the millennial left, and with them of the entire American left, as practically every sectarian leftist organization had by that time liquidated itself into the DSA. Just to take the most notable case, the International Socialists were the largest American leftist organization of the previous few decades. I remember meeting them on this campus in anti-apartheid activity in 1989-90. And this was in part because they had professed professedly had no stake in the fall of the Soviet Union. In 2017, ISO members strongly supported the Me Too movement, and it's unsurprising that at their 2019 convention, much of the longtime leadership of the organization was voted out of office over concerns about unaccountable leadership structures and a damaging internal culture that had a disproportionate impact on people of colors and others with oppressed identities. And in March of that year, the ISO membership voted to dissolve itself, as anyway, they had already gone where the kids were, the DSA. The accusations that Bernie's supporters were bros came full circle with the Hillary run and the subsequent anti-Trump hysterics. Anyone who professed skepticism towards the Democrats was a fascist. The millennial left was dead, but a new generation of intellectual cadre had been drafted to renew the Democratic Party. Oscar Sankara was announced as the new president of the Nation Institute, and the raison d'etre of the left was declared to be the election of Democrats. Sanders' AOC, the squad, marched in lockstep with party leaders as what was arguably the greatest political hoax ever perpetrated by the political and elite media class, Russiagate, was ginned up. And this was explicitly mobilized to advance a bogus and warmongering impeachment of Trump for attempting to expose the manifest political corruption in the Ukraine. The supposedly far-left television news station, MSNBC, became populated by the spooks and ghouls of the deep state, dubbed members of the intelligence community. The nation's COVID response was highly illiberal, forcing people into unemployment and children out of schools, as was dictated by Big Pharma and an increasingly state-coordinated big tech sector. And today, Democrats applaud the political censorship exposed in the Twitter files. Every American socialist principle has been disavowed, as the post-Sanders authoritarianism comprised the entire legacy of the American left and the American Revolution. In short, sorry for being so polemical, Sanders has confirmed, in the name of socialism, the new authoritarian right, one that deeply despises the American people and the best of American history, that is wholly technocratic in its impulses, and is rooted in ruling class institutions like academia, corporate America, and the military-industrial complex, even as the left that the millennials replaced is no more.
So originally in the panel planning, I had quite a regimented schedule for panelists to take turns to respond to each other. But because there are like a few people in the room, I think this discussion will be better as a roundtable. So, I mean, maybe you would like to start, and so start that way. People can feel free to cut in. And also, please ask questions.
So just start?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Well, I consider myself pretty pessimistic. I feel like that was even more pessimistic than I go. I think I do kind of, I disagree with Spencer.
Spencer.
Yeah, Spencer.
Let's not call politicians by their first names. I agree with that. We can call each other.
I disagree with Spencer, particularly on the point. I just think that there's a little bit too much sort of folding in a very wide array of groups and people under the same umbrella in terms of what they stand for. I don't know anyone in DSA who is like a fan of MSNBC. I think that's I think pretty much everyone sees that as pretty much a mouthpiece for a liberal a liberal Democratic Party, and not as as an expression of leftist politics in any way. I'll admit that most of this sort of like politicking predates me a little bit. But I think that among the members of PSA, and I'm a member of PSA. Obviously, I'm on the executive committee for UVA YDFA, and I pay dues. I do think that there is a lot of disagreement and discussions. Personally, I don't really care for national PSA leadership all that much. I don't really involve myself in national PSA affairs very often. I came to campus. I wanted to join a leftist organization. YDSA was here, and I joined it. And I think we're doing good things, and I think we're doing the best we can. And I think that I think there is sort of a little bit of a, I think this is sort of maybe a little bit of a turning point in terms of electoralism, because I do think that in DSA there's a lot of disagreement about, the right way to go with respect to social.
I'd actually like to say something on questions. We'll be doing them in blocks, so if you have a question, just raise your hand, and CC will stop the discussion for a second and let everyone with questions ask their questions. And the panelists will then be able to respond to the questions as a whole.
They have horrible
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, sorry. I think that they're all very, very interesting comments. I think that one of the I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine back in 2020 about or maybe it was even 2016 about the full throated support for sort of coalescing of the broader American left around the Sanders campaign. Oh, it was 2020. Okay, I'm remembering this conversation. And I remember I said that a friend of mine is a Marxist, which I am. I will, as you probably tell, I am very much the token social democrat on this panel. The same as some of the old SDSers. I remember asking him, I certainly get the logic behind throwing your support behind, Sanders and really mobilizing around this campaign. I think that that's actually a viable way of political politics and political culture. But it really cuts against the sort of long-term institution building, radicalization process that was supposed to be the sort of core of far-left politics. And, it's to the effect of, well, that's true. There are no shortcuts, but there's an opportunity here to go further through electoral politics than there ever has been in my lifetime. And he's my age, so he's probably been in the mid-30s. And it's a gamble worth taking. Now, I disagree with a lot of what you said, Spencer, but what I will say is this, that it is true that electoral politics is not a shortcut. Say Sanders had won in 2016 or in 2020 in the primary. Or say, he won in a general election. It's not as if the political struggle ends with an electoral victory. There needs to be something to fall. I was just having this conversation with my colleague earlier today. There needs to be something to fall back on, some kind of institution, some kind of, whether or not it's a form of matter politics, something else, to actually fight back against the inevitable political backlash, counter-mobilization. Now, all of that being said, though, this is where I am much, much, much less pessimistic. I'm pessimistic in the sort of broad, as we're all kind of like, but something very, very significant that I think was different in 2016 and 2020, and I think going forward, is that the median American voter, for want of a better term, is not in the same position as in 1968 or 1972. So in 1968, you have 57% of the country voting for either Richard Nixon or George Wallace, who is Richard Nixon very much on steroids. In 1972, you have against very much a Sanders lady. In the 1972 election, George McGovern is the Democratic candidate for president. He is kind of the Bernie Sanders of that moment. He's supposed to be the guy who is like, youth vote, rah, rah, rah. We're gonna fundamentally change the country. And I think McGovern is very, very, insofar as you could say, a politician, was like the most decent one of all of those people in the 1972 Democratic primary. He only gets 39% of the vote. Absolutely wiped out in 1972. But it's not 1972 anymore. You have in 1967 the majority of the country is behind the Vietnam War, but a supermajority of people under 25 are supporting the Vietnam War. I don't mean to like scapegoat the baby boomer generation any more than I normally do anyway. But it's a
That's a great fact.
well, the thing is a generational analysis, and I have this debate with people all the time.
You're saying that the support for the Vietnam War was greater among the young in 1967. That's great. I've never heard that.
When I first learned that, I was shocked by it. But so you have a particular generation shaped by this sort of broader post-war American affluence. Even people who later moved, quote unquote, left. Hillary Clinton's a perfect case in point of this. She was a Goldwater supporter in 1964. She campaigned for it. Before becoming a Democrat, and it's a very different, the formative experience of being a young person in America. I can speak for myself as the millennial, as England. It's very different. As a white middle class millennial, in the context of 2001 and the war on terror and the war in Iraq, the financial crisis compared to the 1960s and 1970s. And I think that a lot of the, I've encountered this in the wild, the old SDSers who want to, avoid the same mistakes. I get where they're coming from, but I think that they're assuming that the country and sort of the broader geopolitics for that matter are more or less unchanged, which is just not where I think we're at. I'll shut up.
I don't see any evidence that any of these organizations are good at avoiding the mistakes of any other organization. So, but I did want to say, should we pause so that people can ask questions and say that we're almost an hour in?
I want everybody to have a chance to respond before we get to questions.
Okay. I can just be brief. I'm not being pessimistic. Whether the critique lands or not, the critique is in the service of trying to determine where we are. And I'm certainly not interested in criticizing any young person for joining a leftist organization. It's not about criticizing people. It's about understanding where we are historically. And what I was trying to argue, obviously my deep socialist instincts are that I don't think the Democrats are better than the Republicans, like at all. Right? For me, that's like the beginning of all wisdom politically. Very much agree that there has to be something other than electoralism. Socialist tradition, as David said, doesn't understand politics in the way that capitalist politics understands it. I think it's about it's about civil and social organization that involves a kind of electoral arm, at least if we look at the history of the American left, right? Eugene V. Debs is not parallel to Bernie Sanders, right? What I would say is that about the Democrats is that I do think that they're a remarkably conservative organization in the literal sense that they don't change very much. They've been practicing for a very long time in this country a kind of ethnic constituency politics. And that got recalibrated as a result of the 1960s and is kind of expressed in the McGovern campaign. But a kind of ethnic constituency brokerage of capitalist politics really has nothing to do with the socialist politics. It's this kind of language that we get of like intersectionalism, which is really a way of branding capitalist politics as like multiple constituencies, and you balance the different interests of these constituencies.
So I should say that's not at all what Crenshaw means.
It's not what they mean, but it's what it means now to me. And I guess I would say that something like the Combined River Collective was just, it was never, first of all, it was never really a viable leftist organization at that point, right at the end of the New Left. And it's a kind of, I think it's confusing. What I was trying to raise with respect to the millennials and with respect to the orientation strategy in the 1960s with Bayer Trust is simply to say that there's an impulse to turn to socialist tradition, a very degraded, tattered, politically useless man, far from power, not anywhere near power, hasn't been in a super long time. And yet the millennials trying to take that up, right? That's why I was trying to trace a decline and a collapse, because they actually thought about reconstituting socialism in the United States, and they wrote about it. And so did the New Left. The New Left wasn't just about overcoming Jim Crow and stopping the Vietnam War. It's right there in the name. They wanted to be a new socialism. They rejected American social democracy and the legacy of American communism, and wanted to reconstitute socialism. And that's the strategy that nominally motivated this sort of farcical replay of the 60s reorientation strategy of like taking over the Democrats. That's what I was trying to say, is that we have to reflect upon, as useless and out of date and utterly distant from power, deservedly so, as the leftist tradition is, the discontents of that generation certainly gravitated to it. And it wasn't just about getting, it wasn't just about really what the Sanders campaign was, which was a kind of dramatic replay of the Jesse Jackson protest campaigns of the 80s, right? That was a kind of collapse that took the form of a historical tableau, like a dramatic historical tableau. But underlying it was really kind of the giving up of a generation, to me.
Historical accounts, it's not like wrong. I don't think that most of the stuff is right. But I still feel like we sort of missed it entirely if we're not talking, at the very least, about like the decline of labor unions, the rise of Reaganism, and what that means for like who it is who understand themselves, to have any proximity to anything called the left. So, I mean, we here are not a departure from that demographic. I mean, I and we and many of y'all we are in an academic environment. We came from or are seeking a certain kind of like middle class life. That's what university education sort of does to you in a certain way, is it gives you this sort of premature middle class respectability. I mean, whatever else we're talking about vis-a-vis the left, it seems impossible for me in that setting to be talking about mass politics. Like, there aren't enough people like me. And thank God, because like, who wants that? But like, which is maybe to say, well, I don't know. I I guess maybe I'd be interested to hear what y'all think. I mean, there's a reason we're having these conversations in a university setting. There's a reason why, like, 3/4 of the panel are college professors, and not just because we're a university, but because, like, we are absolutely outside. Yeah, and our comrade began in Charlottesville. I mean, there's a reason. It's because we are kind of like massively outside demographic, like a thing that understands itself to be the institutional left in the United States. So, if we sort of can't think beyond that, or if we don't recognize that, or if we don't know how to organize beyond that, and I will say right now that I do not know. So I don't know exactly how to do that. I've done a lot of organizing. Then I think we should, like, dive into the fun. But I would kind of like to not. So I'm wondering if we can think at all, and we like people who think for a living, like about what it means to think about the left beyond a kind of sort of stalwart representation among like the creative class. I guess that is maybe what I am missing hearing.
I'm not going to say.
Yeah.
I'm going to let them ask questions and then I'll respond.
Right, I'm sensing from the shifting in the room that people either really want to leave or have questions. Alex, you have a question.
I'll start. I think it's really important, Emily, that you brought up the question of labor unions, because I think that's sort of an arena that the left has historically done well since the New Left. Sort of the idea that movements should sort of come from the working class, and that's no truer in a place like a union. But I'd also question the fact that unions are even staying on the left. A lot of them are endorsing mainstream democratic politics. I know from the Boston area, the IBEW there has basically just started endorsing mainstream democratic candidates. They even endorsed Anissa Savvy-George over Michelle Wu in the mayor election, which I think Mayor Wu winning in 2021 was sort of the only exception to the rule, that sort of the progressive Democrats were starting to fall, but then you could even see that in midterms later. But I think sort of the question is, are unions still a representation of the left, and how far, since sort of that folding into the mainstream left, how far has it gone, and is it too late?
I thought I have super strong feelings about that. Should I say something, or are we taking more questions?
Let's do one at a time. That would be the answer.
So I think this is like the question. So congratulations on that. My observation kind of descriptively is that like the American left is like desperate for unions to be the thing we want them to be, right? So if you think about like a couple of the Amazon campaigns, like the one in Alabama, there were like celebrities flying down to Alabama to like take pictures of themselves in front of like the people passing out like literature outside like the Amazon warehouse. And that campaign lost. More to maybe, closer to home, like last year, one of the photo shops tried to organize, and like every leftist in the city got real excited about that and like wore red shirts, and they lost. All right, and that was a tiny shop, like 14 people. So the first observation is maybe just that like we the left, and I actually think this is very actually related to our sort of professional position. We're desperate for like the real working class to like stand up and be a thing so that we can like get on board, right? Like please, like be the vanguard so that I, with all my degrees, can like, hold a sign in support of you. Like please, we beg of you, right? But organizing is really hard. So, extraordinarily hard, like interpersonally and in terms of the kind of professional risks you take. And the people burn out in very significant ways all the time. What it means to like feel as though you're embattled at your workplace is like exhausting all the time. But the other thing, as you say, is that like unions, and I think the left is a little responsible for this, are not like an insurance policy that just like kicks in when something goes wrong, right? Like unions go wrong all the time. Unions are not representative of their members all the time. Like very frequently that happens. And that's true, and even more true of like the big industrial unions. So like I think the question of the left has got to be like union ? So because I take it for granted, or I take it as like axiomatic, that we all understand that like work is a meaningful site of power, right? You have something, actual thing that capital needs. And because of that, you have like a kind of collective power. We all understand this to be true, at least theoretically. But unions in real life don't work like that. Just descriptively. The Michigan House just repealed their right to work law. This is like an extraordinary repeal. So like may it stay. It looks like it's going to pass the Senate. Like theoretically, Michigan could be a non-right to work state. I grew up in Michigan, so I hope one day to like maybe live in a state that is not a right to work state, which means that people can't opt out of union affiliation in a union shop. So, but like the reason that it got that far, that Michigan, the kind of foundation of like industrial unionism for like many decades, could then become like a right to work state, is because like the unions like were unhelpful lots of the time, and also like an extraordinary number of like Michigan union leaders are like now in prison. So there was like significant corruption as well. Like these things seem like things that we should be real honest about. And also about the fact that we really want those things to work. We think those things are really powerful, and they are. Like everyone should read accounts of the Amazon organizing on Long Island. Was it Long Island or Staten Island? Not at my New York Island. So Staten Island, which was like extraordinary. I mean, it was sort of like old style interpersonal organization of the kind that you must do if you're trying to bring together like people from like very like disparate ideological affiliations, and also who speak like a million different original languages, and also who are tired and work 3 jobs. So that was like extraordinary work. That's what I have to say about that, which is mostly just to say like, good question, and that sounds hard. But also like, it just basically is the question. So if we only spent time sort of working through that, we would still be doing something meaningful.
I'm going to piggyback off that, go in a slightly different direction. And again, I'm going to put on my Soviet Dev hat here. I apologize. So I will say a couple of things here. One, that unions in general, as a rule, they have to be transactional. You know, they are political institutions that are, by definition, that are beholden to. It's not just a question. I mean, there are some unions that are like very much in bed with the Democratic Party, especially at senior levels. The American Federation of Teachers is probably the most predominant. They have to deliver to their members.
And that's a little different.
Well, but sometimes, you know, I mean, again, I can't speak to the context of what's happening in Boston, but, you know, the IBEW endorses a conservative Democrat. There is a certain transaction politics going on there. Now, that being said, and to your point about union corruption, you know, again, I mean, I'm going to be the optimist here. It's not 1975 anymore. Not only is Jimmy Hoffa long dead, his son is no longer the president. Yeah, but his son is no longer the president of the Teamsters either. You have Sean O'Brien in there now. I'm not saying that Sean O'Brien's perfect, but it's a significantly different kind of union leadership than existed even 5 years ago. And I think there is more interest, although it's nowhere where it needs to be, even among the big industrial unions, towards investing in not just new organizational drives, but investing in, you know, actually doing the kind of organizational work within the union they should have been doing for the better part of 30 years. But the sort of thing I will say here is that I very, very strongly believe, I think that this is true historically, that union power in the United States has historically required some degree, and, you know, we can have a debate about, you know, the legalization strategies in the 1930s going forward here. But I do think that, you know, the single most pivotal moment in American labor history, maybe traditionalist here, was the Wagner Act, which establishes as a right under federal law the right to collectively bargain. So I'm very curious to see what happens in Michigan, because this is a sort of litmus test of, well, what happens when in a state that was very historically pro-union and was one of the first, in fact, before the Wagner Act was passed, established a right to collectively bargain in 1934? I think it was 34. what changes in that state going forward. I mean, it's not a coincidence. I mean, the Voto's union drive is a case in point. So too is unfortunately union drives on this campus. That it's hard to organize a union anywhere. It's next to fucking impossible in the American South. It has historically been the case.
And this is the worst state.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
So
Congratulations.
So it's a real problem, but so I mean again that's when thinking of and again this is where so many people who are in the union movement end up being in the position where okay, well, we have to support the Democrats. I mean, supporting the Democrats even in this state is actually not going to repeal right to work, and it's been made abundantly clear. But that's why a lot of those leaders make that calculus, because in order to get into a legal position where you do that, and you got to play the political game. But that's also not a substitute for the kind of deep internal organizing that needs to happen within unions in order to again, it's all about electoralism is necessary but not sufficient. That's basically my thesis here. Necessary but not sufficient to actually gain and contest political power. You need to do fucking everything all at once. It fucking sucks, but that's. I'm going to come back, but I really have to go to the bathroom. So you can bad mouth me on. Why the fuck did that guy wear a tie?
Not at all. I mean, I'll just say that it's important, if we ask ourselves what happened to the 60s left, right, what happened to the 60s left is they proletarianized themselves in the 1970s. A lot of serious young people went into the labor movement during a time that was, after all, a really militant decade, right? The 70s were a really militant decade for American labor. And all of the heads of unions today who are like 70, 75, they come out of that experience of the new communist movement in the 1970s, or they come out of the ISO, which built Teamsters for a Democratic Union, right, et cetera. The SEIU, you go through any of the American labor movement, you will find a bunch of old Maoists, basically, from the 70s, right, which was the mainstream of the American left. I know they don't tell you that in school. Mainstream, the American left coming out of the 1960s, the new communism, which was Maoist. Part of the problem that I see with the millennials is they seem absolutely intent upon repeating every strategy of the 60s, whereas they sort of began with the promise of breaking with that past. Now we have to have a new civil rights movement. They can't do without a new civil rights movement, without a new women's movement, and without a new proletarianization, right? Without a new rank and file strategy, right? For these people, to hear them talk, you would think that we live in 1965. I mean, that's the way the whole world talks, right? I don't think, and this is one criticism I'll make for David in his absence, I'll repeat it when he comes back. I don't think much changes. I think things get really degraded and confused. And it's very hard for young people to imagine the way that they are enacting a kind of puppet play, but with puppeteers holding the strings that are generations dead, right? It's very hard to imagine the way that the past weighs like a nightmare upon the brains. And the way in which what is new is just the return of the old. Right? That's what capitalism is. Right? What Sanders and Trump are about are reconstituting capitalism for your generation. That's what it's about. Right? That's what capitalist politics has to do. Capitalism has to reconstitute itself politically, not just economically, but politically. It has to create a state order, right? And that's what's happening here at the end of the crisis of neoliberalism. And what I would say to young people is, yeah, there needs to be a labor movement. Why does there need to be a labor movement? Because that's what happened in the 19th century. Right? We don't exactly know, right, what the future, I'm not exactly sure that there's a future for Marxism and for socialism. I'm really not. But I do know that it haunts the present and nothing new emerges. Right? That the discontented present reaches back to this old wound of the defeat of the left in the 20th century. I don't know why you have to read Marx and Lenin in order to become a Democrat today, but that seemed to be what was going on in the DSA. Right? I entirely approve of just saying, look, I'm a social democrat. I don't have anything to do with it, right? But why do you need to read, Lenin's What Is to Be Done to go and knock on doors for Bernie and Iowa? Right? But that's what you see people doing. That's a very strange cultural and intellectual phenomenon.
Why did you need to read Cicero to be a revolutionist in what becomes America in 70?
I mean, I'm not sure reading anything over.
Yeah, fair.
You read things and do things.
Who was it that said we're all Marxists now? Right? It's an effect what Nancy Pelosi said to AOC. Right? Patting on the head, that's nice that you come from this radical movement, right? My name is Mama Bear, and I'll tell you how we do things here in the heart of the empire, right? Like that's very, it's charming that you're a Marxist. It's like, so are we all. We're all on the side of the brothers. So, well, they're all, they're going to speak in the terms of racial justice and addressing the needs of the poor. To talk about Chicago politics is to talk about a Democratic Party that will never address the needs of the poor. I lived there for 20 years. They just discard generation after generation of young people. And the Democrats are the architects of it. They are the architects of it in the concentrated heart of our social problems, i.e. they run every American city. Right? They administer capitalism. They are the party of capitalism and war. Right? That is what they are. And that's what they're doing now. Right? They are administering misery and austerity and war. And in the name of, a very progressive social agenda. And look at our administration. It's pretty funhouse mirror stuff. Right? All that I'm trying to say, to get to your point about, look, we're intellectuals, we're academics, we're not the working class, I completely agree. Right? All I'm saying is to young people who are interested in these ideas, maybe you can just think through the ideas as intellectuals. Right? Maybe there's no clear way to go out and beat the pavement. Right? I think that carrying signs or, proletarianizing yourself or trying to be relevant is, at this point, always a way of silencing the sort of leftist impulse in you, intellectually. Right? Allow yourself to contemplate the ideas of the history of the left. Allow yourself to contemplate the legacy of Marxism, the legacy of the American Socialist Party or the American Communist Party, without assuming that it has any outlet, because I'm not sure that it does right now. But I know that trying to bypass the impasse of our tradition, which is really what we're facing, it doesn't work. Right? It just becomes sort of actionism. It just becomes a way of using activity or activism as it's a sort of activism. It's almost like a psychological displacement. That would be my point. It's like a straight appealing. Just be young intellectual leftists. Stare into the heart of that problem.
So I have a couple of things I want to say about what you said, Spencer. I think, first of all, I kind of disagree as someone who is, very active in young leftist circles and someone in the DSA. I think that you kind of have it backwards in terms of reading Marx to go knock on doors for Bernie. Sorry. You said I could say Bernie.
Hey,
Everyone I know and myself included, is knocking on doors for Bernie and then going to read Marx afterwards. That's their introduction to the movement, and that's how they get things started when there isn't that intellectual base, and then they are
Stick with reading Marx and forget about nothing. What you're saying. That's what I'm saying.
right. And well, I'm saying that a lot of people, I've become kind of disillusioned with electoral politics myself. I wouldn't say it like 100%, just because, frankly, the way I see it, it's really easy to vote, so I'll just cast a ballot, but I'm not going to knock on doors. I'm not going to really, I typically don't really engage with that sort of thing. And then the other thing I would say is that I think that kind of what the whole panel is getting at is, and you were talking about how especially what you said, there is no mass politics of the left. We're a bunch of, white middle-class intellectuals. And so in the various ways, whether it be, various imperfect ways, whether it be through labor unions or intersectionality or whatever, where the left is trying to reach beyond that small group to get mass politics and find, he's trying to find the, find people who are going to be receptive to it and expand in that way. And I don't know, it's kind of, it's hard for me to, I'm not saying that we're doing it right. And I don't think anyone knows how to do it right. But in terms of, trying to build those mass politics, and I think that that's necessary. And even if that sort of thing has failed in the past, I don't see any chance of success, whatever that would look like, without something of that nature.
But, and I want to jump in here and say, and re-emphasize this point. I tried to make it a couple of times now, that, in terms, the Sanders campaign, to bring it back to Sanders,
Mm-hmm.
Sanders campaign failed in 2016 in an absolute sense. Hillary Clinton was then president. What was the final margin again in 2016? I need to, in terms of the vote count, Sanders.
It was close. Are you actually? It was.
Yeah, no. I'm not. I don't want to pull
anybody thought it was possible.
It was close in 2020, but here's the point. That, yeah, a lot of people, particularly in the sort of mainstream political classes, thought that was a fluke in 2016. That it was a result of dissatisfaction with Clinton, maybe sexism or what have you, and there was all elements that play. But that clearly Sanders is a fluke. Democratic socialism is a fluke in American electoral politics. It's going to go back to complete irrelevance. And that didn't happen in 2020. Again, didn't win. Actually lost some of the margins in a more crowded field. But we're still talking about a pretty significant chunk of at least the Democratic primary electorate that voted for social. It says it's social democrat, in the New Deal sense. But that is in and of itself, I think, very significant. It does not mean that, certainly not the revolution, certainly not even victory, is around the corner. Absolutely not. But it's not the same as the total irrelevance of the American left, basically from the 1960s through the 1990s. I think that's significant. And again, where do we go from here? That's the real business.
What is to be done?
Yeah, what is to be done? I don't know. I don't know, but I do think that the situation is not as dire necessarily as I think that some of the comments in this panel have made it out to be. Again, I don't think that victory in the near term is likely. But
I think that the left have a collective idea of what it would mean.
I completely agree. But at the same time, it's not 1989. The end of history has been gone. History is, if nothing else, being contested again.
So, okay, wait. I actually think we popped ourselves into a good, like, this is
Let
very
me pick up
comfortable.
on 2 points.
Yeah.
There's 2 points.
Okay.
First of all, David pointed out that he had a conversation with a friend where they had talked about the Sanders campaign as a strategy for building the left. Right? One way of understanding what I'm saying is that if that was the case, that strategy was never implemented. People thought that the point was to get Sanders elected. Right? They did not think what the old social Eugene Debs wasn't trying to be elected president. It wasn't the point at all, and everyone was very clear about that. Right? You use their system to run around and make speeches about socialism, right? Because you're running for president, right? It had that character, right? It wasn't like there was no confusion about it. Whereas there was a great deal of confusion. There were seasoned American leftists that were involved in this, someone like Adolph Reed will tell you that was the idea, or even Cornel West will tell you that was the idea. Another thing that I think David was gesturing towards, and also my other panelists, is that, and I don't think that young people actually are taught these things by the left anymore. Maybe, I hope you get taught this in the youth. Right? There's a whole world to play for outside of electoralism. Right? And it's not just unions. Right? Socialists wouldn't be bothered about getting Democrats elected to reverse the Dobbs decision. They would organize the provision of abortions where they are, legal or illegal. Right? They would organize labor, legal or illegal. Right? They would extend their hegemony over the ACLU. They would get those lawyers to stop supporting the Democrats and to start supporting the rights of the radical left to assemble and to speak freely, etc., and to get them out of jail, and so forth and so on. Professors would go to workers' schools. Right? There's a whole domain in civil society which is where socialist politics lives and breathes. Right? It isn't about taking power unless you're trying to make a revolution and achieve socialism. I mean, that's the old tradition. Now, if you don't believe that, if that's not the horizon, people should say so. Right? That's what I'm saying. Like, if you're going to read Marx, you're in that world. Right? You're thinking about socialism as a future state of society. Now, if that's not what you mean by the left, fine. Right? If what you mean is like the Democratic Party and you think the state's always going to be with us and, you know, it's about reform, an honest reformist, I've got no problem with. Well, so I can have an argument with that.
Are you saying that the Cascades are genuine socialists, though? Is that what you're getting at? Are you saying that the Cascades, like the SPD reformists, Bernstein, et cetera, aren't
They make an argument, right? That we're revising socialism, that the old 19th century, right? He's a revisionist, right? He says Marx is out of date.
Well, you said that.
Well, I'm saying that if you, there is a tradition, of course, that embraces the necessity of the state, and you can look at someone like Ralph Milliman, right? Who will say, look, we're never going to overcome the capitalist state. What we're going to do is reform it. Right? All that I'm saying is that there's a lot of mendacity on it, right, about these things.
I think it's, that's like about intention. I think like it's sort of like not knowing how to.
It's not that people being mendacious, right? It's people lying to themselves, and the way you keep lying to yourself is you lie to other people. You convince yourself.
I think that, but that's also just part and parcel of political culture. Like, I mean,
Sure.
You have to believe, because you're at
Well, also being a lot.
Well, yeah, at the end of the day, you have to believe, and this isn't even just a problem for the left. Everybody has to believe that they have some form of political agency to, assert themselves in the world. Certainly the far right believes that. And And, you know, it's one of those things where when we think about what does it mean, and again, I'm not even necessarily talking about what it means to, you know, build an effective left. What does it mean to build an effective political movement? Well, and this is the Sanders campaign in a nutshell. Even if it's a failure, even if it doesn't work, I mean, you know, look at the Seventh-day Adventists. When those guys suddenly weren't like raptured up to heaven in 1840, they didn't stop believing their shit. They just changed it up a little bit. It became the great disappointment, but it renewed their faith. And again, you know, really thinking about politics, I'm going to get on my little soapbox now, I apologize. There is a spiritual as well as material dimension to politics. And when you're building a political movement, you need to have that spiritual aspect tended to, especially when, as is inevitable in any political movement, even among the neoliberals, look at the libertarians. You think they're happy with the way the world works? I mean, they're wrong and they suck, but anyway, all of which is to say that, you know, what Sanders provided was an alternative to, in sort of broad narrative terms, to a kind of, it's not even that we're defeatists necessarily, but like we just kind of expect not to win. And that's fair. That's very much based on historical experience. But when you're building a political movement, you have to believe that you can do something. And that, I think, is why Sanders remains very popular, especially among young people.
I think that, Spencer, the one thing that I really agree with you getting at is that there's a lot of confusion. I would say by itself, I don't have like a clear path forward. I don't see like a particular mode of organizing as like, this is the way that things need to go, this is the way we need to go about things. But I do think that to a little bit of an extent, I do think that you're underestimating the diversity and the healthiness of debate, within, the modern left and in these spaces, that there is a lot of, I think that sort of maybe the most obvious ones are electoralism and unions, just because they're sort of pre-established associations, and so that's where people sort of turn to first. But I do think that people are organizing in creative ways and trying to find avenues, and I don't know, don't count us out yet, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm not going to say anything.
Yes. Sorry.
I said I have to go really.
Oh, right. Okay, can we have one question that is easy to answer?
I don't think there's such thing.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Great question, Alex. Or you can answer first.
Okay, here's the right answer to one thing. You should definitely read all the books. So, and reading the books, this is important. This is my strong stand. And this is sponsored by some reading book group, right? So you definitely read all the books. And this is really important. You should not assume that reading the books that there's any that there's any fixed relationship between what you read in the book and how it is you act in the world, right? So it isn't the case that you read Marx because you bought into a kind of 19th century account of post-industrial revolutionization. You read the book because you read the book, and because it's good to think with people who aren't you and who live in times which are in some ways unthinkably different from us, but also kind of like us. But here's how you do it: you read the books with people. So, which is actually what I want to say. The only kind of thing I'm totally sure about is that politics is collective by definition. By definition. If you believe you are a political person and you do not belong to some group, then you are in a sense acting apolitically. You have not begun to think politically. You haven't entered into politics. You're just a brain in a jar who sometimes says things. So politics is collective. When you enter into a group of people and start doing a thing, even if the thing is you're reading Marx, then you are, even in the most kind of embryonic sense, beginning to do politics. Because you're doing a thing with people. So, and that is a thing that I think we cannot say enough. So, and it's definitely right that reading the books together is actually a good thing to do. And Spencer is right that people rush to do stuff so that they can be said to be like organizing, and sometimes the stuff is useless and or counterproductive. And would be better if you were reading books or like sleeping. So that is the right answer to that. So, but you must act collectively, and I mean it. So in a real way, you must be able to organize something consistently, even if the something is like a very small kind of group of people who are going to get together, right? That is what it means to act politically. Without it, you have not even entered into like beginning realm where you could be said to be like a person who is political. So politics is collectivity. It is not like a kind of individual assent to a set of like axioms. So, you know, like where you can kind of like get a perfect score and like win leftism. So that is not politics. That is some other thing. This is politics. That is the right answer to reading.
Read Marx, but not as a how-to.
Have a conversation. Yeah.
I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Overall,
And this is why I'm criticizing someone for joining the TSA. You have to join organizations. You can't learn outside of an organization. What are the other people helping you to do, and what is organizing helping you to do? It's helping you to actually experience your own time, which is really hard work.
That's really interesting.
Right? To actually try to learn something from being is really difficult. What I would say about the spiritual dimension of politics and the Marx and this sort of thing is that history got us in its grip. Right? The failures of the past are in us. Right? I read it somewhere. I read it somewhere, and I agree that history is in your innermost thoughts and your deepest discontents. Right? It's not like just you. Right? There's nothing that anybody feels in terms of why they're angry at the world that everybody else isn't feeling. Right? And the past is this vast project of freedom that feels like it lies in ruins. Right? And it's that freedom that is what I would call the spiritual dimension of politics. Right? Is that it's not done with us. Right? I would say that socialism in the 19th century is not done with us. Right? In the whole, horrific corpse-stacked, reality of the 20th century, history is is becoming like intractable for people, right? And you're landing up here as young people, and they're not telling you about it, right? They're just like, oh, this is where the store is, this is where you get your food, and here's your cafeteria card, and they're not explaining to you that there is this massive series of defeats and catastrophes that is unfolding all around us, and that makes this war never end, right? Makes this police state never end, puts our society under occupation by bodies of armed men, right? When you think about, where does all this come from, right? Where do the cops and the criminals come from, and the war, et cetera, right? It's coming from history. It's not coming from human nature, right? You won't begin to understand it that way. You can't agree that it's not like a logical problem. Right? It's not like, well, this is human nature, and this is how we all get along, and this is how society works, right? And it's like people are acting rationally, right? And you can just divorce yourself from the past. It's not true, right? There is a society is accumulating through time, right? And that's really what politics is about.
Yes, that is the correct answer.
It's your question for David.
I think his answer would be interesting. Okay.
I can stay for maybe 5 more minutes. Then I can.
Okay. That's definitely not an easy question to answer. Sure. Back, I guess, and try not to kill each other over it either. And that is, I think that there's something missing from this conversation about what is the new after the left, and it's also I guess, more relevant for me and younger people, that the biggest way that I feel so many people are learning and starting to organize is like where you see this mass spread of information like you've never seen before. It's like without the internet kind of actually almost changes so much in such good ways and such horrible ways. And it's like I'm going to be honest, I'm introduced to the left through Bernie, and I'm fine being a social democrat, and I see the thing that starts to almost radicalize me is I see I'm talking about graphs of Antonio Gramsci on like TikTok. And it's serious. It's like it's this sort of way on the internet that is totally new, and I've of course sort of gone past just learning everything on TikTok, but it's springboard. The springboard for me to be introduced to all of this. Like without doing that one day, I probably wouldn't like be in this scene, have joined YDSA, all this sorts of ball getting rolling. But at the same time, it also can allow people to almost be able to sit back and just like, oh, all these things are happening, and I can watch, Hassan debate this random right-wing guy, and it's like, oh, politics is happening. All right, I'm good. But it's like, but it is like, what, do you think it's necessarily good or bad to use the internet as a tool for money? And also, you study the right wing and how it, the exact same thing happens over there.
So I'll say a couple of things here, and actually, what I'll say is that it feedbacks out. So one of the reasons why I think it actually is important to still read the old books, again, not necessarily used as a how-to guide, but to provide at least some degree of ethical ground. Because if you're getting your politics, or not if you're getting your politics, but if your introduction to politics is through TikTok and through learning about Gramsci online, which is great. But even just learning about Gramsci online, you can go in a couple of different directions. I just had to reread because I was signing in for my class in a couple of weeks, one of Curtis Yarvin's old blog posts. So you're familiar with Curtis Yarvin? Mencius Moldbug, right? So one of the architects of, the Dark Enlightenment, the neo-reactionary Silicon Valley crack. And these guys will refer back to people like Gramsci. They'll talk about Carl Schmitt too, and some other people. But I think that they lack they get to those positions for a couple of reasons. One, they're in Silicon Valley. They're usually, sitting on a fair amount of money. They have a particular class position in they're also very future-oriented in I think, a particularly destructive way. The whole, move fast and break things ethos of Silicon Valley is very redolent to a certain extent of, some of the more, out there futurism of, fascism in Italy in the 1920s and futurism there. So reading the old texts is a good way to, that you're introduced to by these various meetings is a good way to ground yourself and stay up in the ground. But the other problem that you raise, and it's not one that I have a ready answer to, it's this question of this, Anton Yeager or somebody else wrote about this in Jack fairly recently. He was in +1. But it's this concept of hyper-politics. I'm not sure I completely buy it, but just to explain it very briefly, it's this idea that we live in a post-mass politics age because of digital politics. People don't join organizations anymore. They're not part of mass political movements. All of politics is emotive and it's done online. Not to say that it's done completely like an echo chamber type deal, but it's done in this digital landscape where you're acting maybe with some coordination, but as a sort of individual at your computer or on your screen. So you're not completely passive, but you're also not acting politically in the way that I think we've been talking about here. It's a very, very, very tempting pattern to fall into. I'd be lying if I said I didn't fall into it more often and think that, by being angry on Twitter, I'm accomplishing something politically as opposed to actually doing the hard work. So I do think then that the internet is a gateway to living an authentic political life in the broadest possible sense. And this is true, regardless of where you fall in political spectrum. This is true for actual, honest-to-God, self-professed fascists here and there. That's why they, will meet up behind closed doors and, have their own, discord and everything. Because it's not just enough to, think, yeah, Mein Kampf, I'm about this shit. You have to find other people, to share that. Where I think the left has, I mean, even like the most radical of tankies, you know, have a, which I realize is a loaded term, but bear with me. You know, there's at least, to some degree or another, a sort of affirmative liberatory vision for the future there that you know can be and ought to be cultivated. That's where I think the power of the left in this digital landscape can go. Does that make sense at all? Again, but short answer, I don't know. It's a good question.
But also, like, isn't part of the answer that, like, you should watch Gramsci talk with people? Like, the Gramsci TikTok can be your pet. So, the problem with the internet. I like
Do a political education event this Friday.
like Gramsci talk.
Yeah.
So, but, like, I mean, the challenge of the internet is it puts you by yourself staring in the street, right? That's bad. But I don't think functionally or like structurally it's totally different from like the limitations of like looking at a book by yourself. So you have people, you get with them, you talk about the thing. So and also Gramsci is very readable, so like you can like move even beyond Gramsci talk. But Gramsci talk with people actually sounds to me like a not unthinkable like, mode of entrance into collective action of some kind.
The thing I was trying to say that was perhaps like a little bit obscure in my opening comments about the sectarian organizations of the past that all had through torture, genealogies, links, ultimately back into like the Socialist Party is that for all of their problems, these were like little propaganda groups, like 100 to 300 to 500 people. The thing that the left that I grew up around provided was the pedagogy, right? It said, like, what is Gramsci, right? Is Gramsci a Leninist? Is Gramsci a Stalinist? Is this orthodox Marxism? Is he a critic of Stalin? Why did he, denounce Trotskyism when he got out of prison? Like, what is, do the words in the prison notebooks just mean what Lenin means by other words, or are they actually different concepts? Right? All of those things, you actually need guides. When you're young, you have to find good teachers. You really do, right? Somebody has to put the books in your hand in some kind of organized way, and then you grow intellectually by ultimately disagreeing with people. Right? I was turned into a social democrat on this campus by Richard Rorty. He was an incredibly powerful philosopher, a big influence on me. He made me a Democrat, right? I was taught, by lots of teachers, Habermas, Moishe Stone, all these teachers, and I was recruited by the ISO and recruited by this organization. And you go to, like, what happens when you go to, like, a rally, or at least what used to happen, is you'd encounter all these people with their tables.
And their newspapers.
And their newspapers, and you think, oh, these are the people who think Malcolm X is a revolutionary. Right? These are the people who think Malcolm X is reactionary. These are the people who think Cuba is a socialist country. These are the people who think it's a, not even, deformed workers' state. Right? All of those things you learn because what the sectarian left was a curation, ultimately, of a historical vision of socialism. Right? And of that tradition. And the problem with, like, internet leftism is that it's like great. Right? I love Marxist.org and all of these wonderful resources that people have. The whole history of the left is there. But I think you still have to find teachers. Right? I think you do. And it's not because you need to an apprentice your whole life. Right? It's in order to gain mastery and to actually be able to teach other people, you have to work through your teachers. Right? And to say, okay, fine, okay, now I'm done. Right? And you'll never learn it in the university. You'll never learn leftism in the university. It'll be like a specter. Oh, we talk about Gramsci, or we talk about... Right, but I'm saying when I discovered the left in anti-apartheid, Richard Rorty seemed to make sense with the anti-apartheid movement in 1990 because that was a right-wing time, right? A very right-wing time.
I have to go. I will end on this note, and I would probably be the only person on this panel to encourage. No, don't actually read it. But there was one thing Edmund Burke was right about, and that's everybody read it before. Yeah. But one of the things Edmund Burke was right about, he was wrong about that. So the little platoons of society actually matter. They don't have to be the church or the family. You know, what the GOP says, and you know, but the little platoons of society can be something as simple as a reading book, something as simple as a an organization bound by culture. But again, the internet is a beginning for that. It's not. I have to go because I have to go have more detailed conversations with my friends. I just blew off. Shut up. No, but yes.
We can do this one of two ways. We can, if people still have questions, going. If you guys are willing to stay, we can keep going, or we can dismiss everybody and you can come up to panelists individually. Democratic process. I'm in favor of saying, says aye.
No, if they have any questions to ask, they have to ask them in front of everybody, not individually to us. Don't be shy. Because your questions other people have.
Okay, fine. Spencer veto.
Okay, so this was this was kind of like first directed at Nick and then I guess at Spencer, but Emily, I'd love to hear your input too. So I was wondering about like the Bernie movement, or I guess the Sanders movement, as kind of a vindication of the post-New Left collapse of like genuine, or as I would consider genuine, like liberation movements into the Democratic Party of like the 80s, following the, I guess, the collapse of the New Left. Whereas, like, I know at least here on grounds because I came in the fall of 2019. I got involved with UVA for Bernie because that was like the left on grounds. I don't know if your experience was similar, Nick, but then it kind of folded into YDSA on grounds, which I don't think was really a thing until it got vitalized, I guess, by the people who were mostly in charge of UVA for Bernie. And so I'm wondering if that's, I think a lot of the post-Sanders or Sanders leftists, if you will, whether you consider them leftists or glorified Democrats, however you may consider them, folding in a sense, I think, into the DSA, and I think with Sanders's like maybe not approval, but like following his God, I don't know if this is making sense. Sorry, but like the way that Sanders and like AOC and the rest of like the squad are like affiliated in some sense with DSA, I think, or at least they purport themselves to be affiliated with DSA in some sense. And I'm wondering if like there's kind of a vindication of that loss of the socialism of the New Left in the collapse of Bernie socialism into DSA socialism.
Yeah.
Did that make sense? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think that I would say that, I think a lot of people, including myself, we went into Bernie really like just full tilt, like that was what we had and we were really excited about it. That was the first political action that we really got involved in. And sort of one of the big points that I've been trying to make is that I think that in some sense, yes, there is. I can see where you're coming from in that you have UVA for Bernie and just Bernie in general folding, UVA for Bernie folding into UVA YDSA, and in a larger sense, Bernie folding into DSA, and DSA being such a dominant political organization. And I see Spencer's point about how, I do believe that there's good debate, within that organization, but it's not like everyone has their tables. There's, like weird, there's like weird coalitions and factions and a lot of it really doesn't really work.
Sectarianism has caucuses.
No, absolutely. It is. And there's a bunch of weird ones, and you can check out all the weird things they believe. And so I think that a lot of people saw the failure of Bernie. David was talking about to what extent it's a failure, and I do think I'm a little bit more optimistic about, I think there's a lot of confusion about the goal of it, but I do think it brought a lot of people into the left, whether that was the goal or not. I think a lot of those people have, tried to find new modes to work in because they saw, that maybe this is not the right path forward, and I'm that way. So, yeah, I mean, I see your point that there's, that maybe DSA has been sort of de-socialized, and I think a lot of people, including myself, are not particularly happy with like the top brass of the organization in terms of their positions on a lot of things. But I don't think that, I think that debate and that that sectarianism, as Spencer would say, is still alive, and I think that people are still looking for new modes, even if it just within this organization that from the outside seems to have a sort of collective vision.
Nick, let me ask you something about your experience in the DSA. If I hear like the collapse of the left into the DSA, like what are we really talking about? Like to me, it's like the inner independence of a young person. Like the thing that scares me about young people, like if they look at something like the Twitter files, or if they're discussing, the COVID response, is that what they want to know, first of all, or immigration, what they want to know, first of all, is what's the right-wing position, what's the left-wing position? And what they mean is Democrat and Republican, right? Why did the sects exist? They existed in a subculture. There was this weird phenomenon of like subcultures that maybe even Emily remembers. I certainly remember. It was like culture and art and the left, and it just felt very distant from like Bill Clinton or like what you saw on TV, right? And that distance was a problem. And what the millennials wanted is like, no, we can't bear to be distant from this anymore. The world's going to hell in a handbasket. And we have to bring the left to bear. There has to be some relevance here. And the problem is that they completely identified with the Democrats, because that is the obvious way to quote unquote be relevant. But the sectarian problem is a real problem. Like, it's like, and what I would encourage people to do is like, preserve that inner independence. It's like, so with respect to immigration, I have nothing to do with either one of these parties. They both want to exploit immigrant labor or exploit American labor. Right? That's what it's about. All sides of the debate are about the exploitation of labor by capitalist America. The only solidarity that you can have is with the people around you that the cops might ask for their papers. Right? With that, there's no question that you have solidarity with the people you work with. Right? In other words, the labor movement could have an immigration policy, which is to say you don't come in here and talk to anybody about their immigration status. Right? And everyone has to be paid the same, and you can be a member of the union no matter what. Right? That kind of independence, or the independence that you have to have when you look at the Twitter files, and you see the Democrats censoring political discussion in America, You cannot ask the question, is Matt Taibbi left or right? You have to ask the question, what are they saying about the state of our society? And of course, of the state. Right? You have to preserve, in other words, you have to think of Matt Taibbi as one way or another a member of society, as a journalist, right? Who's like holding the powerful accountable to the extent that he's doing real journalism. Right? Rather than ask what I see too many young people doing. This is what I hate about the ESA, is it's turning people into Democrats. Right? Like, well, you gotta get that other booster. Like, well, what about what these dissident scientists say? Don't worry about what those dissident scientists say. No, the dissident scientists are members of society. Right? I mistrust these people. Right? In power. I'm not saying what to believe about COVID. I'm just saying your only comrades are in society. And the Democrats at this point are practically the whole state bureaucracy. And that's why I said, like, throw Trump things in a said, right? Which is that the bureaucracy really did turn on. They really do want war in the Ukraine. Right? They did, all these military officers really did appear at that impeachment. And Brennan and all of these other horrible people really did talk Democrats into going along. Right? It was like crazy. And now, guess what? Here we are in this horrible war. And nobody, no young person opposes it.
That's true. I would say not much. I would say
Where's the movement? There's not an anti-war movement because they're Democrats.
I wouldn't say on COVID there's much debate within the leftist circles. I mean, I would say that on Ukraine there's a lot of very spirited debate on, certainly on your side, for sure. I mean, you're right that there's not,
But the two front runners for the Republican primary both come out against the war. Now, how many young people are going to talk about that? The whole anti-war sentiment is going to get swept up by the Republicans. Trump and DeSantis are both against the war. Right? Young people can talk about whatever they want. Right? There can be a Jacobin article about whatever, but it is Democrats. Their politics is linked to that. And it's their war now.
I guess I don't understand, each party is going to co-opt the different things that they're going to co-opt. I think there is relevance to, talking about it and talking about it from a lucid perspective. And on the perspective that,
I'm just saying all those people who are anti-war that Trump and DeSantis are going to appeal to, they're our comrades. They hate the war. They hate the government. They hate this war machine. Right? They are not fascists. Like, in as much as what they are is against the rottenness of this war, whatever else it may be. Right? But there's a deep rot in it, which barely gets covered in the news. Right? And today, young people are being taught to call those people fascists and to call the war makers our side. And it's kind of nuts. Like, that's all I'm saying. Right? That's all I mean by the inner, independent mind, right? Which comes from really kind of a historical sense. Sorry, Emily, you guys.
No, I would wonder, and then we have to call it.
Yeah,
after 9 o'clock.
I could promise these people that they can leave at 9. So.
But I guess I maybe wonder if, like, GSA is kind of the odd category out here. I mean, millions of people voted for Sanders. GSA has something like 90,000 members, and most of them are on paper only. So, and the ISO, the International Social Service, and NSP had like 5,000 members. So, these are like infinitely teeny little creations. So the internet is bad in this sense because it elevates all these sort of like internal debates between a tiny little subset of people and makes it seem like a big thing that everyone should care about. But there are like sort of institutions or there are sort of means of like thinking more largely about politics. I guess I'm not convinced that DSA is one of those, or at least is not very successful at doing that yet. If anything, it's like losing numbers a little bit. But it is possible to be with people and to try to think more clearly about how it is that you ought to be in the world. That is possible to do. So that seems at least sort of like a good place. And that can happen in DSA, but I wouldn't like it too close to like,
Yeah.
feel like DSA is an institution.
No, I actually really agree with that. I feel like I've sort of been, we've been going into, I'm sorry, you said we were going to edit, but like, we've been going into these like really, really, micro, like tiny groups. And like you said, I do believe that there are, in many places, in some places you wouldn't expect, there are potential comrades. And so I think that there is, outside of whatever you think of DSA and the people ahead, exactly. Me too. I think there is, there's potential, and there's, there are groups that can be more.
Well, I guess what I would say is, this is going to sound like super intellectualist and arrogant, but like, the Brianna Joy Grays, and the Crystal Balls, and, what's his name, Nathan Robinson.
Well, these are people who write.
These people who write, right? They're all reading Bhaskar Sankara. They're all reading Bhaskar Sankara, right? Whether they disagree or agree. So it is like actually a very small number of people who influence millions in terms of ideas and the debate over politics. And if you're my politics, you're not in that conversation at all. You're just nowhere. It's obscure. It's you're not in that discussion. But what you do learn at the university is you learn the skills that may be combined with a serious leftist education could be of relevance at an intellectual level. Right? Like, not like I organized by knocking on these doors. This is UVA. Right? These are students who, I think, didn't Crystal Ball go here? I believe she did, right? This is where the reporters and the journalists and the intellectuals, especially the people in this room, where did they come from? Right? And it's a question of like thinking about like, how do I conduct that self-education? Right? I still think that, historical socialism was a working class movement tied to a bunch of bohemian intellectuals. Mostly Jews. A couple of notable exceptions like Lenin, but mostly Jews. Right? Coming out essentially of the French Revolution. And when we say that the great socialists of the 19th century, whether they were workers who became intellectuals or they were just bourgeois intellectuals like Marx and Engels, that's who we talk about, right? The actual ideas and the parties that became sort of petri dishes for the development of those ideas. It's important, right? And otherwise, you just end up doing what Bhaskar did, right? Which is become the new what's her name, Catherine Vanden Heuvel, Katrina Vanden Heuvel for his generation. Right, the editor of The Nation magazine, the oldest vehicle of American progressive capitalist politics. Right, that's what he's done. It's an acceptance of his. He takes responsibility for what he's done. Right, in the sense that he's saying, well, this is where all that I've done leads. And I think he's right about that assessment. It's a real drag. That's all that we get. It's kind of an intellectually vivified Democratic Party.
I guess it's the end of it.
It's like the panelists are kind of,